The imposing Gothic architecture of Westmoreland University's mathematics building loomed against the slate-gray October sky, its weathered limestone facade a testament to over a century of academic tradition. Rain pattered against the tall arched windows of Hall B, where advanced theoretical analysis was about to begin, creating a steady rhythm that matched the nervous tapping of many students' pens against notebooks. Marcus Washington arrived 15 minutes early, as was his habit. He chose a seat in the middle row, not so far back as to suggest disinterest, but not so close to the front as to draw unnecessary attention. The lecture hall, with its steep incline of wooden seats and worn oak desks, gradually filled with students dressed in the unofficial uniform of higher mathematics. Rumpled sweaters, messenger bags burdened with textbooks, and expressions of mingled dread and determination. Marcus wore a simple charcoal hoodie over a plain white t-shirt, jeans that had seen better days, and scuffed sneakers, practical attire for a student who spent most nights working at the campus library to supplement his partial scholarship. Unlike many of his classmates who carried the latest tablets and laptops, Marcus relied on a weathered notebook filled with precise, meticulous handwriting and a collection of mechanical pencils with erasers worn down to nubs. At precisely 9:25 a.m., the side door opened and the air in the room seemed to crystallize. Several faculty members entered, their presence unexpected and immediately unsettling to the students. Among them was Dr. Harrison Wells, chair of the mathematics department, whose silvering temples and perpetually furrowed brow had intimidated generations of undergraduates. Behind him walked Professor Eleanor Blackwell, a Fields Medal nominee whose research on topological quantum field theory was considered groundbreaking. But it was the figure who entered last that caused Marcus's stomach to tighten, Professor Richard Harmon, whose reputation for intellectual brutality preceded him. Tall and angular, with a permanent downward curve to his thin lips, Harmon was known for his mathematical Darwinism, the belief that most students were simply unworthy of higher mathematics and should be weeded out as quickly and mercilessly as possible. The faculty members took seats in the front row, arranged like judges at a tribunal, their leather-bound notebooks and fountain pens a stark contrast to the plastic and digital tools of the students behind them. As whispers rippled through the hall, Marcus caught fragments of conversation. "Why are they all here? It's supposed to be some kind of demonstration class. I heard Harmon pushed for stricter admission requirements for the math program." At 9:29, the double doors at the back of the hall swung open with decisive force. Professor Alexandra Bennett strode in, her heels striking a precise rhythm against the worn wooden floor. Her steel-gray suit matched her precisely bobbed hair, and the light glinted off the rectangular frames of her glasses as she surveyed the room with clinical detachment. Bennett was a polarizing figure in the department. Her brilliance was undeniable. Her work on differential geometry had revolutionized the field, but her teaching methods were controversial. She believed that mathematics was not a subject to be coddled through, but a discipline that required absolute precision and ruthless logical thinking. Mistakes were not learning opportunities in her classroom. They were unacceptable failures of reasoning. As she reached the lectern, she placed her leather portfolio down with methodical precision, her movements economical and practiced. The room fell silent without her having to utter a word, the collective intake of breath as students straightened their postures and readied their materials. Marcus felt her gaze sweep over the audience, pausing momentarily as it reached him. He'd encountered this before, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible tilt of the head. It was the look of someone recalculating an equation that didn't quite balance, a variable that didn't belong. He was used to being that variable. As the only black student in advanced theoretical analysis, and one of only 7 in the entire mathematics program, Marcus had grown accustomed to the double takes, the underlying assumption that he must be in the wrong room, that his presence was some kind of administrative error rather than the result of earning his place through merit. From the front row, Professor Harmon leaned toward Dr. Wells, his voice pitched low but carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. "Affirmative action case in the 3rd row. I give him 2 weeks before he drops." Wells chuckled softly, nodding in agreement. The diversity initiatives are well-intentioned, but mathematics doesn't bend to social engineering. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened. These weren't new sentiments to him, just the latest iteration of the same prejudice he'd faced throughout his academic career, from his public high school in Baltimore to the prestigious halls of Westmoreland. Professor Bennett cleared her throat, silencing all conversation. Today's lecture will cover multivariable Laplace transforms and their applications in solving non-homogeneous differential equations. She turned to the massive blackboard that spanned the width of the room and began writing with quick, precise strokes, her chalk scratching out complex notation with the confidence of someone who had long since internalized these concepts. As equations filled the board in neat rows, Marcus observed a subtle shift in Bennett's derivation. A small but crucial error in the third line of her work. Where she had simplified the expression by factoring out a term, she had inadvertently dropped a negative sign that would cascade through the rest of the calculation, leading to an entirely incorrect conclusion. He glanced around the room. Other students were frantically copying down the equations, trusting in Bennett's infallible reputation. The visiting professors watched with approving nods, seemingly unaware of the mistake. Marcus hesitated, his pencil hovering above his notebook. Speaking up meant drawing attention to himself, attention he typically avoided. It meant challenging a professor renowned for her intolerance of interruption and her blistering responses to perceived incompetence. It meant making himself even more visible in a space where his very presence was already considered suspect. But allowing the error to propagate felt like a betrayal of the mathematical truth that had been his anchor since childhood. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't discriminate. They simply were, pure and perfect in their objectivity. Taking a deep breath, Marcus raised his hand. Bennett continued writing for a moment before noticing the raised hand in her peripheral vision. She turned slowly, her expression suggesting that interruptions were as welcome as a virus in her classroom. Yes? Her tone carried the chill of a January morning. Professor Bennett, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the sudden attention from every person in the room. I believe there's an error in the third line of the derivation. The negative sign should be preserved when factoring out the coefficient. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that seems to have physical weight. Bennett's expression remained unchanged, but her posture stiffened slightly as she turned back to examine her work. In the front row, Harmon scoffed audibly. Typical, he muttered to his colleagues, just loud enough to carry. They always think they know better. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on Bennett, ignoring the burning sensation at the back of his neck as he felt the stares of his classmates and the judgment of the faculty. He'd been right about the mathematics, and that was what mattered. Not Harmon's thinly veiled racism, not the discomfort of his peers. Bennett studied the board for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. When she turned back, her expression remained unreadable, but there was a new quality to her gaze as it fixed on Marcus, something between irritation and curiosity. Your name? She asked. Marcus Washington, Professor. She nodded once, a curt acknowledgement. Mr. Washington is correct. There is indeed an error in my derivation. She erased the offending line and rewrote it with the proper sign, continuing the calculation to its now correct conclusion. The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the room. Bennett was not known for acknowledging mistakes, let alone conceding to a student's correction. Mathematics is unforgiving of carelessness, she continued, addressing the entire class but with her eyes still fixed on Marcus. One small error can invalidate an entire proof. Remember that. She returned to her lecture, but the dynamic in the room had shifted. Students cast surreptitious glances at Marcus, some impressed, others resentful of the disruption. In the front row, Harmon's expression had darkened, his earlier amusement replaced by something harder, more calculating. As the lecture continued, Marcus kept his focus on the material, carefully noting each step of Bennett's increasingly complex derivations. But part of him remained alert to the undercurrents in the room, the silent recalibration of assumptions, the reluctant recognition that perhaps he belonged there after all. When the class ended 90 minutes later, students gathered their belongings with the shell-shocked expressions typical after one of Bennett's lectures. As Marcus closed his notebook, he noticed Bennett watching him with an evaluative gaze. "Mr. Washington?" she called as he stood to leave. "A moment." Marcus approached the lectern, aware of Harmon and the other professors lingering nearby, ostensibly gathering their materials but clearly interested in the exchange. "Your correction was accurate," Bennett said without preamble. "How did you spot it so quickly?" "The subsequent equations wouldn't have balanced properly with the signs reversed," Marcus explained. "The symmetry would have been broken." Bennett's eyebrows rose slightly. The closest thing to surprise her composed features seemed capable of expressing. "You saw the consequences before I had even written them," she observed. It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded anyway. "Yes, Professor." She studied him for a moment longer, then reached into her portfolio and extracted a sheet of paper, which she handed to him. "The International Collegiate Mathematics Competition is being held at Princeton next month," she said. "Westmoreland is fielding a team for the first time in 5 years. Based on your performance today, I'm offering you the opportunity to compete." Marcus looked down at the paper. An application form for the ICMC, one of the most prestigious undergraduate mathematics competitions in the world. His pulse quickened at the opportunity, but he was also immediately aware of the implications. This wasn't just an academic challenge. It was a public stage where his performance would be scrutinized, not just as a mathematician, but as a black mathematician presumed by many to be out of his depth. "The competition is extremely rigorous," Bennett continued. "Only the most gifted students have any hope of placing. If you're interested, I expect you to prepare accordingly." From the corner of his eye, Marcus could see Harmon's skeptical expression, the barely contained disdain. "I'm interested," Marcus said firmly. "Thank you for the opportunity, Professor Bennett." She nodded once. "We'll see if your confidence is warranted, Mr. Washington. The preliminary trials begin next week." As Marcus left the hall, application in hand, he could feel the weight of expectations, both the high ones he placed on himself and the low ones others placed on him, settling across his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the campus glistening under watery sunlight. Marcus took a deep breath of the cool autumn air, centering himself as he had learned to do over years of facing similar situations. The competition would be challenging, perhaps the most difficult test he had yet faced. But it was also an opportunity to prove his abilities not just to Bennett or Harmon or his classmates, but to himself. And for Marcus Washington, who had grown up solving equations by candlelight during power outages and teaching himself calculus from discarded textbooks, the opportunity was all that mattered. The rest was just noise, distracting but ultimately irrelevant to the pure, perfect truth of mathematics. The campus library at Westmoreland University operated as its own ecosystem, with distinct territories and hierarchies that students instinctively understood. The ground floor, with its comfortable seating and ambient conversation, belonged to underclassmen working on group projects and literature majors annotating novels. The second floor housed the sciences, its long tables often covered with molecular models and the scattered remains of study snacks. But the third floor, specifically the mathematics reading room tucked into the northeast corner, was sacred ground, its silence broken only by the occasional turning of pages or the scratch of pencil against paper. This was where Marcus spent his evenings, surrounded by bound volumes of mathematical journals and reference texts whose spines had been worn smooth by generations of seeking hands. Tonight he had claimed a secluded carrel near a window that overlooked the campus quad, its amber desk lamp casting a warm circle of light that contrasted with the deepening blue of dusk outside. The application for the International Collegiate Mathematics Competition lay open before him, its requirements daunting even to someone of his abilities. Participants would face 3 rounds of increasingly difficult problems, beginning with a written qualifier that covered everything from number theory to complex analysis. Those who advanced would tackle an 8-hour exam featuring original research problems that had stumped even established mathematicians. The final round would be a live demonstration before judges and an audience, solving problems in real time with no preparation. As Marcus reviewed past competition problems, making notes on solution strategies, he became aware of someone hovering near his carrel. "So it's true," said a voice tinged with barely disguised resentment. "Bennett actually invited you to the ICMC." Marcus looked up to see James Chen, the unofficial star of the mathematics department's senior class. With his designer glasses, cashmere sweater, and the unmistakable confidence of someone who had never been told he didn't belong, James represented everything Marcus was not: privileged, connected, and assumed to be brilliant based on pedigree rather than proof. "She did," Marcus replied neutrally, unwilling to be drawn into whatever confrontation James seemed eager to initiate. James leaned against the carrel, uninvited. "You know, most of us have been preparing for this competition since freshman year. Some legacy charity case swooping in at the last minute doesn't really seem fair, does it?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Mathematics isn't about fairness, Chen. It's about correctness." "Easy to say when you've been handed an opportunity you didn't earn," James retorted, his voice low but intense. "We all know why Bennett picked you, and it wasn't because of your brilliant insight into sign errors." Marcus had encountered this insinuation too many times to be baited by it now. The suggestion that his achievements were the result of diversity initiatives rather than merit was a familiar weapon wielded by those who found his presence threatening to their sense of natural superiority. "If you're so concerned," Marcus said, returning to his notes, "perhaps you should focus on your own preparation rather than mine." James's lips thinned, but before he could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Leave him alone, Chen. Your insecurity is showing." Both men turned to see Aisha Rodriguez, a fellow senior whose reputation for mathematical intuition was matched only by her impatience for academic politics. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a stack of reference books that suggested a study session as intensive as Marcus's own. James straightened, his expression shifting from confrontational to defensive. "This isn't about insecurity, Rodriguez. It's about standards." "Right," Aisha said dryly. "And I'm sure you've appointed yourself the guardian of those standards out of pure academic concern." James glanced between them, seemingly weighing whether to continue the argument, before settling on a dismissive shrug. "Whatever. Good luck with your preparation, Washington. You'll need it." With that, he stalked off toward another section of the reading room. Aisha watched him go, then turned back to Marcus with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't let him get to you. James has been the golden boy around here for so long he thinks the sun rises specifically to illuminate his brilliance." "Thanks," Marcus said, genuinely appreciative of the intervention, though somewhat wary of its implications. He wasn't looking for a defender or for pity. Both carried their own kind of condescension. As if reading his thoughts, Aisha's expression became more serious. "I'm not here to rescue you, by the way. I just can't stand James and his entitled attitude." She hesitated, then added, "I saw what you did in Bennett's class. That took guts." Marcus shrugged slightly. "It was just a mathematical error." "We both know it was more than that," Aisha replied. After a brief pause, she nodded toward his notes. "Working on the ICMC prep?" "Trying to," Marcus confirmed. "The competition problems are intense." "Tell me about it." "I've been going through the archives from the last decade, and some of these make our coursework look like elementary school arithmetic." She shifted her weight, seeming to come to a decision. "Listen, a few of us meet Tuesday nights in the Math Commons to work through past competition problems together. You should join us." Marcus hesitated. Study groups had never been his preference, partly because of the social dynamics that inevitably arose, and partly because he had always learned better on his own, moving at his own pace without having to explain his thought processes. Noting his reluctance, Aisha added, "No pressure. But different perspectives can be helpful with these kinds of problems. Sometimes the solution requires a completely novel approach." "I'll think about it," Marcus said, which was as close to a commitment as he was willing to make. Aisha nodded, seeming to understand. "Fair enough. We start at 7 if you decide to come." With a small wave, she continued on to her own study space, leaving Marcus to his thoughts. Returning to his notes, Marcus found it difficult to regain his concentration. James's words, though intended to discourage, had inadvertently highlighted the stakes of the competition. For someone like James, failure would be a disappointment but ultimately inconsequential. His future in mathematics was already secured by family connections and the assumptions of capability that came with his background. For Marcus, the calculation was different. Success wouldn't just be a personal achievement. It would be seen as a validation of his right to be in spaces like Westmoreland's mathematics program at all. Failure wouldn't just be a setback. It would be interpreted as confirmation of the biases held by people like Harmon and James, proof that he didn't belong. The unfairness of this double standard was not lost on Marcus, but dwelling on it was a luxury he couldn't afford. The equations before him didn't care about the color of his skin or the circumstances of his admission to Westmoreland. They demanded only clarity of thought and precision of execution, qualities Marcus had cultivated since childhood. With renewed focus, he turned back to a particularly challenging problem involving non-Euclidean geometry, losing himself in the elegant abstraction of mathematical reasoning where, for a few hours at least, the complexities of human bias gave way to the pure logic of numbers. Professor Bennett's office was located in the oldest part of the mathematics building, a corner room with tall windows that flooded the space with natural light during the day but now admitted only the dim glow of campus lampposts. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing mathematical texts in multiple languages, their spines arranged with the same precision that characterized everything about Bennett's professional life. As the department's most senior professor worked late into the evening, her attention was divided between grading student problem sets and contemplating the unexpected development in her advanced theoretical analysis class. Marcus Washington was not at all what she had expected. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, not looking up from the paper she was marking with brisk efficiency. Professor Harmon stepped into the office, bringing with him the faint scent of expensive cologne and the air of someone accustomed to deference. "Alexandra," he said by way of greeting, taking a seat across from her desk without waiting for an invitation. "I think we need to discuss your impulsive decision regarding the ICMC." Bennett finally looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "There was nothing impulsive about it, Richard. Mr. Washington demonstrated exceptional mathematical insight." He spotted a sign error, Harmon dismissed with a wave of his hand. Hardly the mark of a prodigy. "He spotted the implications of the error before they were even written," Bennett corrected. "That indicates not just attention to detail, but an intuitive grasp of mathematical consequences that is quite rare." Harmon leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he often used when trying to persuade colleagues to his viewpoint. "I understand the pressure from the administration to show progress on diversity initiatives, Alexandra. But the ICMC is not the place for social experiments. Our reputation is at stake." Bennett's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I wasn't aware that recognizing mathematical talent had become a social experiment, Richard." "You know what I mean," he pressed. "The boy has no pedigree, no advanced preparation. He'll be competing against students who've been groomed for this kind of competition since before college. It's setting him up for failure, and embarrassing the department in the process." "His name is Marcus Washington," Bennett said, her tone cooling several degrees. "And his pedigree, as you call it, is irrelevant to his mathematical abilities." Harmon sighed, the sound heavy with exaggerated patience. "You're being deliberately obtuse. His transcript shows he attended a public high school in Baltimore that doesn't even offer advanced placement calculus. He hasn't had the foundation necessary for this level of competition." "And yet," Bennett replied, "he was able to spot an error that neither you nor any of our other esteemed colleagues noticed during the lecture. Curious, isn't it?" A flush of anger crept up Harmon's neck. One lucky observation doesn't qualify him for the ICMC. There are other students, James Chen for instance, who have been preparing specifically for this competition and have the proper background to represent Westmoreland. Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying her colleague with the same analytical precision she brought to complex equations. James Chen is already on the team, as you well know, but mathematics is not served by homogeneity of thought, Richard. Different perspectives often lead to breakthroughs that might otherwise be missed. This isn't about different perspectives, Harmon insisted. It's about maintaining standards. No, Bennett said firmly. It's about your discomfort with the fact that someone you dismissed based on appearances has demonstrated mathematical ability that challenges your preconceptions. Harmon stood abruptly, his composure finally slipping. You're making a mistake, Alexandra. One you'll regret when he crashes and burns at Princeton. Bennett returned to her grading, a clear dismissal. That will be for Mr. Washington to determine, not you or me. If there's nothing else, Richard, I have student work to evaluate. After Harmon left, Bennett sat back in her chair, her thoughts returning to Marcus Washington. She had not been entirely honest with Harmon about her motivations. While she genuinely believed in Marcus's mathematical potential, her decision to invite him to the ICMC had been partly influenced by her own history in the field. As one of the few women to achieve prominence in theoretical mathematics in her generation, Bennett was intimately familiar with the barriers erected by those who believed certain types of minds were inherently better suited to mathematical thinking. She had fought that battle herself, endured the dismissive attitudes, the higher standards, the constant need to prove herself beyond what was asked of her male colleagues. Bennett prided herself on her objectivity, on judging students solely on the merit of their work. But she also recognized that true meritocracy required actively dismantling the biases that prevented talented individuals from being recognized in the first place. Marcus Washington would have to earn his place on the ICMC team through the same rigorous process as every other candidate, but Bennett was determined that he would have that opportunity based on his mathematical ability, not denied it because of factors entirely irrelevant to the elegant precision of numbers. With renewed focus, she returned to her grading, her red pen moving across the papers with methodical purpose, marking each error with the same exacting standard she applied to all her students and to herself. Tuesday evening found Marcus standing hesitantly outside the Mathematics Commons, a large room on the first floor of the Mathematics building, equipped with whiteboards, comfortable seating, and tables designed for collaborative work. Through the glass panels in the door, he could see a small group already gathered, including Aisha Rodriguez and, to his dismay, James Chen. His instinct was to turn around, to return to the solitude of his carrel in the library where he could work without the complications of social dynamics. But something made him pause, perhaps the memory of how quickly Aisha had seen through James's posturing, or perhaps the simple recognition that isolation, while comfortable, had its limitations. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed open the door and stepped inside. The conversation paused momentarily as heads turned toward him. Aisha smiled, rising from her seat at the central table. "You came," she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "Everyone, this is Marcus Washington. Marcus, this is our ICMC study group." Besides Aisha and James, there were 3 other students whom Marcus recognized from various upper-level mathematics courses. Min-Jun Park, a quiet senior known for his work in algebraic topology. Elena Kovalev, a junior whose paper on combinatorial game theory had recently been published in an undergraduate research journal. And Thomas Reyes, a senior who specialized in computational mathematics and had interned at NASA the previous summer. James's expression soured at Marcus's arrival, but the others offered nods or brief greetings. "We were just about to tackle this year's qualifier from MIT's internal competition," Aisha explained, gesturing to the whiteboard where a complex problem involving differential geometry was written out. "Want to join in?" Marcus set his backpack down and approached the board, studying the problem. It involved finding the minimum surface area of a 3-dimensional shape, subject to certain topological constraints, exactly the kind of multifaceted problem that might appear in the ICMC. "I've been working on something similar," he said, pulling out his notebook. "There's an approach using parameterization that might simplify the initial setup." Elena looked interested. "Show us what you're thinking." As Marcus began explaining his approach, sketching diagrams and equations in a corner of the whiteboard, He felt the familiar clarity that came with immersing himself in mathematical reasoning. The social awkwardness receded, replaced by the shared language of variables, functions, and logical steps. Even James, initially standoffish, eventually joined the discussion, pointing out a potential issue with one of Marcus's assumptions that led to a productive reconsideration of the problem's boundary conditions. For the next 2 hours, the group worked collaboratively, each member contributing insights from their particular areas of strength. Marcus found himself challenged and stimulated by the diverse perspectives, particularly Minjun's abstract algebraic approach that revealed connections he might have missed working alone. When they finally solved the problem, a solution elegant in its simplicity but reached through a complex collaborative process, there was a shared moment of satisfaction that transcended the earlier tensions. "Not bad, Washington," James admitted grudgingly as they packed up their materials later that evening. "Your parameterization trick saved us at least an hour of computational slogging." Coming from James, this was high praise indeed. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, not quite ready to declare a truce, but willing to accept the professional recognition. As the group dispersed, Aisha fell into step beside Marcus as they walked toward the residence halls. "I'm glad you came," she said. "The dynamics are better with more diverse approaches. James and Tomas tend to bulldoze through problems with computational brute force, while Minjun gets lost in theoretical abstractions. We need more people who can see the elegant path through the middle." "It was helpful," Marcus admitted. "Different from how I usually work, but I see the value." Aisha glanced at him curiously. "How did you get into mathematics? I don't think I've ever heard your story." Marcus was unaccustomed to sharing personal details, particularly about his background, but something about the genuine interest in Aisha's question, free from the usual undercurrents of surprise or skepticism, made him willing to open up slightly. "My father was a structural engineer before he passed away," he said, keeping his voice even. "He used to bring home blueprints and show me how mathematics shaped the physical world, how equations translated into bridges and buildings that could withstand enormous forces." "That's beautiful," Aisha said quietly. "I'm sorry about your father." Marcus nodded in acknowledgement. "After he died, mathematics became my connection to him. My high school didn't have advanced courses, so I taught myself from textbooks I found at the public library. The librarian there, Ms. Jackson, noticed my interest and started setting aside mathematics books she thought might challenge me." "You taught yourself higher mathematics from library books?" Aisha asked, impressed. "It wasn't as dramatic as it sounds," Marcus said with a small smile. "I had good foundational teachers in elementary and middle school, and I found an online community of mathematics enthusiasts who helped when I got stuck." "Still," Aisha insisted, "that's remarkable dedication. Most people wouldn't pursue something that challenging without formal structure." They had reached the fork in the path where they would head to their respective dormitories. Marcus paused, considering whether to share the deeper truth, that mathematics had been more than just an intellectual pursuit for him. It had been a refuge, a place where clarity and certainty existed in a world that often felt arbitrary and unfair, where his worth was measured by the correctness of his solutions, not by preconceptions based on his appearance. But some truths were too personal, too vulnerable to share after a single study session. Instead, he simply said, "Mathematics makes sense in a way that people often don't. There's comfort in that consistency." Aisha nodded, seeming to understand what he wasn't explicitly saying. "Same time next week? We're planning to focus on the algebraic number theory problems from last year's ICMC." "I'll be there," Marcus confirmed, surprising himself with how much he meant it. As he walked back to his dormitory under a sky scattered with stars, Marcus felt a cautious optimism he hadn't expected. The ICMC remained a daunting challenge, and the biases he faced hadn't magically disappeared. But tonight had shown him that collaboration didn't have to mean compromise, that there were peers who could see beyond superficial differences to the mathematical mind beneath. For the first time since receiving Bennett's invitation, Marcus allowed himself to envision not just participating in the ICMC but excelling, not to prove something to Harmon or James or anyone else, but because the elegant architecture of mathematics deserved nothing less than his absolute best. The preliminary trials for the ICMC arrived faster than Marcus had anticipated. Over the past 3 weeks, he had settled into a demanding routine. Classes during the day, work at the library circulation desk in the early evening, and late nights split between the study group and his own intense preparation. Sleep had become a luxury, snatched in 3 or 4 hour increments between problem sets and shifts. Today, as he entered the mathematics building for the qualifier exam, the lack of rest was beginning to show. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his movements had the careful precision of someone operating on willpower rather than energy. But his mind remained sharp, focused on the challenge ahead. The qualifying exam would take place in classroom 307, a medium-sized lecture hall typically used for upper-level courses. When Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, he found several students already seated, arrayed in isolated positions throughout the room, like chess pieces on a board. The atmosphere was tense with competitive energy and pre-test anxiety. James Chen sat near the front, surrounded by neat stacks of scratch paper and a collection of precisely sharpened pencils. He looked up briefly as Marcus entered, offering a curt nod before returning to his last-minute review notes. In the 3 weeks since Marcus had joined the study group, their relationship had evolved from outright hostility to a wary professional respect. Not friendship, but a recognition of each other's mathematical abilities that transcended personal feelings. Marcus chose a seat on the opposite side of the room, arranging his minimal supplies: 2 mechanical pencils, an eraser, and a basic scientific calculator, the only type permitted during the exam. Unlike many of his competitors, he carried no formula sheets for last-minute cramming. Either he knew the material or he didn't. Frantically reviewing now would only increase his anxiety. As the room gradually filled with the 23 students competing for spots on Westmoreland's ICMC team, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, centering himself through a breathing technique he had developed during high-pressure tests in his earlier years. 4 counts in, hold for 7, release for 8. The pattern created a rhythm that calmed his nervous system and cleared mental pathways for the analytical thinking he would soon need. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Professor Bennett entered, followed by 2 graduate student proctors carrying sealed envelopes containing the exam papers. The murmur of conversation died immediately as Bennett approached the lectern. "Good morning," she began, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Today's qualifier consists of 10 problems covering various areas of advanced mathematics. You have 3 hours to complete as many as you can. Partial credit will be awarded for correct approaches, even if the final answer is incomplete. But full marks require both methodological precision and correct solutions." She paused, surveying the room with the evaluative gaze that had become familiar to her students. "The top 5 performers will be invited to join Westmoreland's ICMC team, with the next 3 serving as alternates. Results will be posted by 5:00 p.m. today." She checked her watch with meticulous precision. "You may begin when you receive your exam." The proctors distributed the sealed test packets, moving efficiently through the rows. When Marcus received his, he resisted the urge to tear it open immediately, instead taking another deep breath and reminding himself that methodical pacing would serve him better than anxious rushing. When Bennett finally announced, "You may open your exams," the sound of rustling paper filled the room as 23 students simultaneously broke the seals and confronted their challenges. Marcus scanned the first page quickly, assessing the overall difficulty and structure before diving into individual problems. As Bennett had indicated, the exam covered a broad spectrum: number theory, real and complex analysis, topology, differential equations, abstract algebra, and combinatorics. Some problems were straightforward applications of advanced techniques, while others required creative insights and novel approaches. He decided to tackle the problems in order of confidence rather than sequence, beginning with a differential equations problem that played to his strengths. As he worked, the familiar state of mathematical flow enveloped him, that peculiar mental space where time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, where the boundaries between self and problem dissolved into pure analytical focus. By the first hour mark, Marcus had completed 4 problems with confidence and made substantial progress on a 5th, involving topological mappings. He glanced up briefly, taking stock of the room. Several students were showing signs of frustration, erasing furiously, staring at the ceiling, or massaging their temples. James appeared completely absorbed, his pencil moving steadily across the paper without hesitation. Returning to his own work, Marcus encountered the 8th problem, a particularly challenging question on algebraic number theory that resembled one the study group had tackled the previous week. He recognized that Min-jun's approach from that session could be adapted here, an elegant solution that would have been less obvious working alone. It was a small but significant acknowledgement of how the collaborative preparation had enriched his mathematical toolkit. As the 3-hour mark approached, Marcus was working on the final problem, a complex analysis question requiring a creative application of Cauchy's integral formula. With 15 minutes remaining, he found the insight he needed, quickly translated it into mathematical notation, and worked through the verification steps to confirm his solution. When Bennett finally called, "Time is up. Please put down your pencils," Marcus felt a cautious satisfaction. He had attempted all 10 problems and felt confident in at least 8 of his solutions. Whether that would be enough to secure a place on the team remained to be seen, but he had done his best with the knowledge and skills at his disposal. As the proctors collected the exams, students began to filter out of the room, some comparing notes on particular problems, others maintaining a focused silence. Marcus gathered his materials slowly, mentally reviewing his approaches to the more challenging questions. "How'd it go?" asked a familiar voice. Aisha had appeared beside his desk, her expression a mix of fatigue and relief now that the exam was over. "Reasonably well, I think," Marcus replied, conservatively. "Problem 6 was trickier than I expected. You?" "I blanked completely on the topology question for about 20 minutes, she admitted. Then suddenly the approach became obvious, and I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it immediately. "That's how it goes sometimes," Marcus said with a small smile. "The solution seems impossible until it's inevitable." As they walked out of the classroom together, they found James waiting in the hallway, his typical confidence somewhat subdued. "Washington, Rodriguez?" He nodded to each of them. "What did you make of problem 9? This was James's way of gauging his performance against theirs, not openly asking how they did, but probing specific questions to triangulate their overall success. "The combinatorial optimization?" Marcus clarified. "I used a generating function approach after transforming the constraint set." James's expression tightened slightly. Apparently, he had taken a different path. "Interesting. I went with dynamic programming. We'll see which approach the graders prefer." "Both can work," Aisha pointed out diplomatically. "There's rarely just one correct method in advanced mathematics." "True," James conceded, "but elegance matters, especially at the ICMC." The 3 of them continued discussing the exam as they walked toward the department lounge, where many of the participants were gathering to decompress. Their conversation attracted others who joined in comparing approaches and solutions, creating an impromptu post-mortem analysis that revealed the diverse ways each student had tackled the same challenges. Marcus found himself gradually drawn into the center of this discussion, his insights respected and his questions thoughtfully engaged with by peers who, just weeks ago, might have dismissed him entirely. It was a subtle shift, but a meaningful one. He was being evaluated now on the quality of his mathematical thinking, not on preconceptions about who could or should excel in advanced mathematics. As the afternoon wore on, students drifted away to attend classes or get lunch, agreeing to reconvene at 5:00 p.m. when the results would be posted. Marcus headed to the library for his shift at the circulation desk, grateful for the simple routine tasks that would occupy his hands while his mind continued to process the exam problems. At 4:58 p.m., a crowd had already gathered in the mathematics building's central lobby, where department announcements were traditionally posted on a large bulletin board. The qualifier participants stood in small clusters, tension evident in their postures and the stilted quality of their conversations. Marcus arrived just as Professor Bennett emerged from the department office, a single sheet of paper in her hand. The crowd parted silently to allow her passage to the bulletin board. With methodical precision, she pinned the paper to the cork surface, nodded once to the assembled students, and stepped back. "Congratulations to those selected," she said simply. "If your name appears on this list, please attend a mandatory team meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. in my office to discuss next steps." As Bennett departed, the crowd surged forward, students jostling for position to view the results. Marcus hung back slightly, a habit born from years of navigating spaces where pushing to the front often invited unwelcome attention. After the initial rush subsided, he approached the board, scanning for his name among the 8 listed. He found it in the 4th position, not first, but comfortably within the 5 who would form the active team rather than serve as alternates. James Chen had indeed secured the top spot, with Aisha Rodriguez second. Minjun Park and Elena Kovalev rounded out the primary team, with Tomas Reyes as the first alternate. The remaining positions went to students Marcus knew only peripherally from advanced courses. A complex mix of emotions washed through him: relief at having made the team, satisfaction at having his abilities validated, but also an acute awareness that this was merely the first hurdle in a much longer race. The real challenge of the ICMC still lay ahead. "Congratulations," came a voice from behind him. Marcus turned to find Professor Bennett standing there, her expression as composed as ever, but with a hint of approval in her eyes. "Thank you, Professor," he replied. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." "You earned your place," she said simply. "Your solutions showed not just technical proficiency, but creative insight. Particularly your approach to Problem 9, using generating functions, was elegant and efficient." Before Marcus could respond, another voice interrupted, louder, more strident. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Alexandra." Professor Harmon had approached, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of anger and vindication as he brandished a sheet of paper. "I've been reviewing the grading, and there are serious inconsistencies in how partial credit was awarded." Bennett's expression cooled several degrees. "We can discuss this in private, Richard." "I think not," Harmon insisted, glancing meaningfully at Marcus. "When subjective factors influence what should be objective evaluation, it affects everyone." Students nearby had fallen silent, watching the confrontation with uncomfortable fascination. Marcus remained absolutely still, aware that he was both present and being discussed as if absent, a familiar and dehumanizing experience. "The grading rubric was applied consistently to all exams," Bennett said, her voice level but with an undercurrent of steel. "If you have specific concerns about the evaluation process, I'm happy to review them with the entire grading committee." Harmon's jaw worked silently for a moment before he said, "This isn't over, Alexandra. The department has standards to maintain." With a final dismissive glance at Marcus, he stalked away toward the faculty offices. Bennett turned back to Marcus, her professional composure immediately restored. "As I was saying, Mr. Washington, congratulations on your performance. I look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's meeting." As she walked away, Marcus became aware of the stares from other students who had witnessed the exchange, some curious, some sympathetic, some resentful. The implicit suggestion in Harmon's interruption, that Marcus's selection was somehow the result of favoritism rather than merit, hung in the air, tainting what should have been a moment of unqualified achievement. "Don't let Harmon get to you," Aisha said quietly, having appeared at his side. "He's been trying to undermine Bennett's authority ever since she was selected as department chair over him last year. This isn't just about you." "I know," Marcus replied, though the knowledge did little to lessen the sting. "Departmental politics are universal." "Still," she persisted, "you should be celebrating. We made the team." Her enthusiasm was genuine, her smile warm as she added, "Some of us are heading to Blackwell's Cafe to decompress. You should join us." Marcus hesitated, weighing his instinct for solitude against the value of building connections with his new teammates. The past weeks had shown him that isolation, while protective, also had its costs. "Sure," he decided. "I could use some coffee after that exam." As they left the mathematics building together, Marcus found himself reflecting on the patterns that had defined his academic journey. The constant need to prove himself beyond what was asked of others, the way achievements were questioned or diminished, the exhausting vigilance required to navigate spaces where his presence was seen as unusual or unearned. But alongside those familiar patterns, new ones were emerging. The collaborative problem-solving of the study group, Bennett's straightforward acknowledgement of his abilities, Aisha's easy assumption that his place on the team was merited. Small shifts, perhaps, but significant in their cumulative effect. The ICMC would bring its own challenges, both mathematical and otherwise. But for now, Marcus allowed himself to enjoy this incremental victory, to accept the congratulations of his peers without qualification or defense, to be recognized, however briefly, for his mathematical mind rather than marked by external perceptions. Tomorrow would bring new equations to solve, new variables to consider. Today, for this moment, he had earned the right to simply be a student who had succeeded, no asterisks attached. The first official meeting of Westmoreland's ICMC team took place in Professor Bennett's office, a space that reflected its occupant's personality, organized with mathematical precision, furnished with understated elegance, and containing unexpected details that revealed deeper dimensions beneath the professional exterior. Alongside the expected mathematical texts and journals were volumes of Renaissance art, classical literature, and what appeared to be first-edition poetry collections. The 5 team members, James, Aisha, Marcus, Minjun, and Elena, sat in a semicircle of chairs facing Bennett's desk, while the 3 alternates occupied seats against the wall. The atmosphere was one of nervous anticipation as Bennett outlined the competition structure and preparation schedule. The ICMC is not merely a test of knowledge, she explained, distributing folders containing detailed information. It's an assessment of mathematical creativity, resilience, and performance under pressure. You will face problems that have no established solution methods, questions designed to push you beyond familiar territory. She looked at each student in turn, her gaze evaluative. For the next 4 weeks, you'll maintain your regular coursework, but also participate in intensive team training sessions 3 times weekly. I've arranged for reduced teaching assistant duties for those of you with such responsibilities, and your professors have been notified that you may need assignment extensions as we approach the competition date. James raised his hand. Professor Bennett, I've been researching past ICMC participants. The top schools, MIT, Princeton, Stanford, typically send students who've been preparing together for years. We have 4 weeks. How do you suggest we overcome that disadvantage? It was a fair question, one that had occurred to Marcus as well. Most elite mathematics programs began grooming their ICMC candidates from freshman year, building teams with complementary strengths and extensive competition experience. Bennett's response was characteristically direct. By embracing it, Mr. Chen, teams with established patterns tend to approach problems in predictable ways. Your diverse backgrounds and relatively new collaboration may allow you to see novel approaches precisely because you haven't been trained to think along conventional lines. She moved to a whiteboard mounted on the wall of her office. Each of you has distinct mathematical strengths. Mr. Chen excels in computational approaches and algorithmic optimization. Ms. Rodriguez has exceptional intuition for abstract structures. Mr. Washington demonstrates remarkable insight into the geometric interpretation of symbolic systems. Mr. Park's topological perspective is invaluable for certain problem classes, and Ms. Kovalev's combinatorial creativity rounds out the team's capabilities. As she spoke, Bennett sketched a diagram showing how these different strengths might interact and complement each other during the various competition phases. It was a surprisingly holistic view of team dynamics from someone known for her emphasis on individual performance. Your task over the next month, Bennett continued, is not just to sharpen your individual skills, but to develop a collective intelligence, learning when to defer to each other's expertise and how to synthesize your different approaches into coherent solutions. She then outlined a rigorous preparation schedule. Monday evenings would focus on timed problem-solving under competition-like conditions. Wednesdays would be dedicated to analyzing past ICMC problems and the approaches that had proven successful. Fridays would involve specialized training in areas where the team needed strengthening, with guest lectures from faculty members with particular expertise. Additionally, Bennett concluded, I've arranged for Dr. Catherine Zhang from the Psychology Department to join us for 2 sessions on performance anxiety management and optimal cognitive functioning under pressure. Mathematics competitions are as much a psychological challenge as an intellectual one. As the meeting continued, Marcus found himself increasingly impressed by the thoroughness of Bennett's preparation. She had clearly invested significant thought and departmental resources into giving their team the best possible chance of success, despite their late start and relative inexperience. When the formal briefing concluded and students began reviewing their individual preparation assignments, Bennett approached Marcus as he examined the schedule. Mr. Washington, she said quietly, a moment of your time. She led him to a corner of the office where they could speak privately, though Marcus was acutely aware of James watching them from across the room. I want to address what happened yesterday with Professor Harmon, Bennett said without preamble. His comments were inappropriate and unprofessional. Marcus maintained a neutral expression. It's not the first time my achievements have been questioned, Professor. It won't be the last. Perhaps not, she acknowledged, but it is the first time it's happened under my supervision, and I won't tolerate it. Your placement on this team was earned through mathematical merit alone. There was an intensity to her statement that suggested personal investment beyond professional responsibility. Marcus wondered briefly about Bennett's own experiences in a field historically dominated by men who looked nothing like her. I appreciate that, Professor, he said carefully, but I'd rather focus on preparation than politics. Bennett studied him for a moment, then nodded. A pragmatic approach. Nevertheless, you should know that I've filed a formal complaint about Harmon's behavior with the Department Ethics Committee. Not because you need protection, but because the integrity of our evaluation processes matters for all students. The distinction was important, acknowledging the injustice without casting Marcus as a victim requiring rescue. It was a line that many well-intentioned allies failed to recognize, inadvertently reinforcing the very otherness they sought to address. Thank you, Marcus said simply, meaning it. As he rejoined the group, Aisha gave him a questioning look. He shook his head slightly, a signal that he'd explain later if necessary, but that it wasn't a priority now. They had more immediate concerns. Specifically, the sample problem set Bennett had provided for their first official practice session. For the next 2 hours, the team worked through increasingly difficult mathematical challenges, gradually developing the communication patterns and collaborative approaches that would define their ICMC strategy. Marcus found himself naturally falling into the role Bennett had identified, translating abstract equations into geometric interpretations that often revealed solution paths less apparent in purely algebraic form. By the time they finished, a tentative but functional team dynamic had begun to emerge. Even James, whose competitive nature initially made him reluctant to share his thought processes, had started recognizing the value of collective problem-solving for certain types of challenges. As they packed up their materials, Bennett offered a final observation. You've made a promising start, but remember, at Princeton, you'll be facing teams that have been refining their collaborative methods for years. Your advantage lies in fresh perspectives and unconventional thinking. Don't try to become what they are. Excel at being what they're not. It was advice that resonated particularly with Marcus, who had spent much of his academic life trying to prove he belonged in spaces that often subtly signaled he didn't. The suggestion that difference could be strength rather than liability was both challenging and liberating. The following weeks passed in a blur of intensive preparation. The regular training sessions with Bennett were supplemented by informal study meetings in the mathematics commons, late-night problem-solving marathons fueled by coffee and mathematical determination, and one-on-one coaching in areas where individual team members needed strengthening. Marcus found his days completely consumed by the dual demands of maintaining his coursework and preparing for the ICMC. His shifts at the library had been reduced to accommodate team practice. a concession he accepted despite the financial impact, because the opportunity to represent Westmoreland at Princeton felt increasingly significant, not just for himself, but for every student who had ever been told, explicitly or implicitly, that they didn't belong in elite academic spaces. During this period, Marcus also discovered unexpected dimensions to his teammates. James, beneath his privileged exterior and sometimes arrogant demeanor, possessed a genuine love for mathematics that transcended career ambitions or status considerations. His computational precision complemented Marcus's more intuitive approach in ways that produced stronger solutions than either would have developed alone. Aisha revealed herself to be not just mathematically gifted, but also the emotional anchor of the team, diffusing tensions with well-timed humor and ensuring that collaborative dynamics remained productive even during stressful practice sessions. Min Jun, initially so quiet that Marcus had wondered if he spoke English fluently, turned out to be selectively verbal, nearly silent during social interactions but extraordinarily articulate when discussing topological concepts, his passion for the subject overcoming his natural reticence. And Elena, the youngest team member as a junior, combined mathematical creativity with a fierce competitive drive that pushed everyone to higher standards. They were becoming a team in the true sense, not just 5 individuals who happened to solve problems in the same room, but a collective entity with emerging properties distinct from the sum of its parts. 3 days before they were scheduled to depart for Princeton, the team gathered for their final formal practice session in Bennett's office. They had just completed a particularly challenging set of problems designed to simulate the pressure of the live demonstration round, and the results were encouraging. "Your performance today was impressive," Bennett acknowledged, reviewing their solutions. "Your collaborative approach to Problem 6, in particular, demonstrates exactly the kind of team integration we've been working toward." She set down her notes and regarded them with an evaluative expression that had become familiar over the weeks of preparation. "You've made remarkable progress in a compressed time frame. The question now is whether it will be sufficient against teams that have been preparing for years." "We're ready, Professor," James said with characteristic confidence. "Our latest simulation scores are comparable to last year's top 3 teams." Bennett nodded. "Mathematically, perhaps. But the ICMC tests more than just technical skill. It tests performance under pressure, in unfamiliar environments, against competitors who expect to win because they always have." Her gaze shifted to Marcus briefly before continuing. "Some of you will face additional challenges that have nothing to do with mathematics. Preconceptions, assumptions, subtle or overt signals that you don't belong on that stage." The room fell silent as the implications of her statement settled. Though Bennett hadn't specifically identified Marcus or Aisha, the only team members from underrepresented groups in mathematics, her meaning was clear. "When that happens," Bennett continued, "remember that mathematics itself is blind to everything except logical truth. Your proofs don't care about your background, your appearance, or others' expectations. They are either correct or they aren't." She stood, signaling the conclusion of the session. "Get some rest this weekend. Mental fatigue is the enemy of mathematical creativity. We leave for Princeton on Monday morning." As the team dispersed, Marcus lingered, organizing his notes with deliberate care. Bennett noticed his hesitation. "Something on your mind, Mr. Washington?" Marcus considered how to frame his question. "Professor, you've been unusually invested in our preparation, more than would be expected even for an important competition." Bennett's expression revealed nothing as she replied, "I believe in fielding the strongest possible team. That requires appropriate investment of time and resources." "Yes," Marcus agreed, "but this seems personal for you in a way that goes beyond institutional reputation." For a moment, Bennett was silent, and Marcus wondered if he had overstepped. Then, with uncharacteristic candor, she said, "When I was an undergraduate at Cornell in 1984, I was the only woman in the advanced theoretical mathematics program. In my senior year, my advisor told me not to apply to graduate school because women's minds aren't structured for abstract mathematical thinking." She adjusted a stack of papers on her desk with precise movements. "I applied anyway, was accepted to Princeton with full funding, and eventually proved results that particular advisor cited extensively in his later work, without acknowledging their source. Marcus absorbed this information, understanding better why Bennett had been so quick to recognize his mathematical abilities and so firm in defending his place on the team against Harmon's insinuations. Mathematics should be the most objective of disciplines, Bennett continued. Proofs are either valid or they aren't, regardless of who constructs them. And yet, the field remains shaped by biases as irrational as they are persistent. She looked directly at Marcus. Your presence on that stage at Princeton matters, Mr. Washington. Not because of symbolic representation, but because talent denied is mathematics impoverished. It was the most personal statement Marcus had ever heard from the typically reserved professor, offering a glimpse of the convictions that drove her beyond professional obligation. Thank you for sharing that, Professor, Marcus said quietly, and for everything you've done to prepare us. Bennett's expression returned to its usual professional composure. Just solve the problems, Mr. Washington. The rest will follow. As Marcus left the mathematics building, evening shadows stretching across the quad, he reflected on Bennett's words. He had entered this process focused on proving himself individually, showing that he belonged in advanced mathematics despite others' assumptions to the contrary. But through the weeks of preparation, something had shifted. His motivation now extended beyond personal validation to a broader recognition. Every barrier broken made the path easier for those who would follow. This realization didn't eliminate the pressure. If anything, it intensified it. But it also provided a context that transformed anxiety into purpose. He wasn't just solving problems for himself anymore. He was demonstrating possibilities for others who might never have seen someone like themselves on an ICMC stage. With renewed determination, Marcus headed to the library for one final weekend of preparation before Princeton. Whatever challenges awaited there, mathematical or otherwise, he would face them not just with technical skill, but with the clarity of purpose that came from understanding why it mattered. Princeton University's campus in early November possessed a particular kind of beauty. Gothic architecture framed by trees aflame with autumn colors, the air crisp and charged with intellectual energy. Under different circumstances, Marcus might have appreciated the historical grandeur of the mathematics department buildings, with their ivy-covered walls and stone archways that had witnessed nearly 3 centuries of scholarly pursuit. But as Westmoreland's team arrived for the opening reception of the International Collegiate Mathematics Competition, aesthetic appreciation was overshadowed by the immediate reality of what they faced. The Palmer House, an elegant colonial-style building serving as the competition headquarters, buzzed with activity as teams from 32 universities across the world registered and received their orientation materials. "This is it," Aisha murmured as they entered the grand foyer, where students clustered in school-identified groups, sizing up their competition with varying degrees of subtlety. "I didn't expect it to feel so intense." Marcus understood what she meant. The atmosphere contained an almost palpable charge. Brilliant young mathematicians who had spent years preparing for this moment, all converging with the shared understanding that only a few would distinguish themselves from the crowd. Professor Bennett led them toward the registration table with composed efficiency, her presence drawing respectful nods from several faculty advisors. After completing the necessary paperwork, she guided the team to a relatively quiet corner where they could observe the room without being immediately dragged into the social dynamics already forming among the participants. "Take a few minutes to orient yourselves," Bennett advised. "The opening presentation begins at 4, followed by the reception dinner where you'll be assigned to mixed school tables. This is partly social, partly strategic. The organizers want to establish a collegiate atmosphere before the competitive phases begin." James was already scanning the room with analytical precision. "MIT arrived with their full squad," he noted, nodding toward a group of students whose casual confidence suggested years of competition experience. "And Stanford's team is over by the windows. They took 3rd place last year." Marcus followed his gaze, cataloging the assembled teams with quiet attention. The demographics were unsurprising but still striking. Predominantly male, predominantly white and Asian, with only a handful of exceptions that made Marcus and Aisha stand out all the more visibly. Harvard's representatives are notably absent, Minjun observed in his characteristically precise manner, perhaps employing psychological tactics by arriving just before the deadline. Or they're just stuck in traffic like normal people, Elena suggested with a slight smile, her pragmatism a useful counterbalance to the team's tendency toward overanalysis. As they continued their survey, Marcus became aware of subtle changes in the room's dynamics. The occasional glances in their direction, the brief whispers that followed such looks. Westmoreland was not considered a serious contender in this competition, having failed to qualify for the finals in their previous attempts. Their presence was viewed with mild curiosity rather than competitive concern. "Don't let it bother you," Aisha said quietly, noticing Marcus's awareness of the attention. "We're the unknowns, and that's an advantage. No one's prepared for what we might do." "I'm not bothered," Marcus replied truthfully. "Just taking measure." Bennett checked her watch with characteristic precision. "The presentation will begin shortly. After the formal welcome, each team will be introduced. When Westmoreland is called, simply stand briefly and then be seated. No commentary is necessary or expected at this stage." As they moved toward the main hall where rows of chairs had been arranged for the opening ceremony, a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair intercepted their group, his focus immediately on Bennett. "Alexandra," he greeted her, his tone suggesting long acquaintance. "It's been, 15 years? Vienna Conference?" "Richard," Bennett acknowledged with professional courtesy. 16 years, actually. The International Congress of Mathematicians in Berlin." The man, evidently Dr. Richard Keller, Princeton's legendary mathematics professor whose work on probabilistic number theory had earned him consideration for the Fields Medal, smiled thinly. "Ah, yes. Your paper on non-Euclidean manifolds was quite ambitious, as I recall." There was something in his inflection that suggested ambitious wasn't entirely complimentary, a subtle academic dig that Bennett seemed to register but chose to ignore. "Allow me to introduce Westmoreland's team," she said smoothly, gesturing to the students. "James Chen, Aisha Rodriguez, Marcus Washington, Minjun Park, and Elena Kovalev." Keller's gaze swept over them with the assessment of someone accustomed to categorizing mathematical talent at a glance. His eyes lingered briefly on Marcus, with an expression that wasn't quite dismissive, but contained a clear note of skepticism. "Westmoreland," he repeated, as if testing the word. "We weren't certain you'd field a complete team this year, given your limited competition history." "We're full of surprises," Bennett replied, her tone pleasant, but with an undercurrent of steel, "as I'm sure the competition results will demonstrate." Keller's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. Well, best of luck to your students. They'll certainly need it against the established programs." With a nod that managed to be simultaneously polite and condescending, he continued on his way. "Who was that?" Elena asked as they resumed their path to the presentation hall. "Dr. Richard Keller," Bennett explained. "Princeton's team advisor and a significant figure in the mathematics community. Also a man whose certainty in his own judgment occasionally exceeds the supporting evidence." It was as close to criticism as they had ever heard from Bennett, whose professional assessments typically maintain scrupulous objectivity. "He doesn't think we belong here," Marcus observed quietly. Bennett's response was immediate and firm. "What Dr. Keller thinks is irrelevant. Mathematics doesn't operate on opinion but on proof. Remember that over the next 3 days." As they entered the presentation hall and found their designated seats, Marcus felt a familiar determination settling over him, the same focused clarity that had carried him through countless situations where others' low expectations created both obstacle and opportunity. He had long since learned that the most effective response wasn't anger or defensiveness, but excellence so undeniable it forced reconsideration. The opening ceremony proceeded with the academic formality typical of such events, welcoming speeches emphasizing the competition's prestige and tradition, acknowledgments of sponsors and organizers, and an overview of the schedule and rules. When teams were introduced, Westmoreland's standing was met with polite but tepid applause. a stark contrast to the enthusiastic reception for MIT, Princeton, and other perennial powerhouses. Following the ceremony, participants were directed to the adjacent dining hall where round tables had been arranged, each setting identified with place cards that deliberately separated teammates and grouped competitors from different schools. Marcus found himself assigned to Table 7, alongside students from Stanford, University of Tokyo, MIT, and Cambridge. As they settled into their seats and introductions were exchanged, Marcus noted the subtle social dynamics at play. Jason Wong from Stanford and Tyler Schmidt from MIT clearly knew each other from previous competitions, their conversation referencing shared experiences with an easy familiarity that excluded others. Hikaru Tanaka from Tokyo and Emma Williams from Cambridge were more reserved, observing rather than immediately engaging. Marcus Washington, Westmoreland University. Marcus introduced himself when the conversation finally turned his way. First ICMC. Westmoreland? Tyler repeated, his tone suggesting he was trying to place the school in his mental hierarchy of mathematics programs. That's in Michigan, right? Pennsylvania, Marcus corrected mildly. Right, Tyler nodded. You guys haven't competed in the finals before, have you? Before Marcus could respond, Jason interjected with what might have been intended as helpful context for the others. Westmoreland's program is more teaching-focused than research-oriented. It's unusual for them to qualify for this level. There was nothing explicitly offensive in the statement, but the subtext was clear. Westmoreland, and by extension its representatives, didn't quite belong in this elite gathering. Yet here we are, Marcus replied with a slight smile, keeping his tone light but direct. Apparently the qualifying committee found our approach to algebraic topology sufficiently convincing. A brief, awkward silence followed before Emma from Cambridge shifted the conversation. First competitions are nerve-wracking, right? My first year I was so anxious during the written exam that I forgot basic differentiation rules. What about you, Tanaka-san? She continued, turning to the Tokyo student. Is this your first ICMC as well? As the conversation moved to safer ground, Marcus participated while maintaining his habitual awareness of the unspoken currents. This pattern, being subtly questioned, having to establish legitimacy where others were assumed to possess it, was familiar terrain. The challenge, as always, was to navigate it without allowing it to consume the energy needed for the actual competition. The dinner continued with the strange mixture of camaraderie and calculation that characterized gatherings of academic competitors, students simultaneously forming social connections while assessing potential opponents. By the time dessert was served, the initial tensions had eased somewhat as conversation revealed shared research interests and mathematical enthusiasms that transcended institutional rivalries. When the evening finally concluded, teams regrouped with their advisors for brief strategy sessions before retiring to their accommodations. Bennett secured a quiet corner of the now emptying Palmer House for Westmoreland's discussion. Initial impressions? She prompted, looking at each team member in turn. The overall caliber seems consistent with what we researched, James reported with his characteristic analytical detachment. MIT's team is confident to the point of arrogance, but their technical foundation justifies it. Stanford seems more strategically oriented. They were asking indirect questions about our specialized areas. Cambridge and Tokyo are harder to read, Aisha added, more reserved in their approach. They were definitely listening more than talking. Bennett nodded. And how did you find the social dynamics? It was an unusual question from Bennett, whose focus typically remained strictly on mathematical preparation rather than interpersonal elements. The team exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond. There's a clear hierarchy, Marcus finally said. Established programs at the top, newcomers viewed with skepticism until proven otherwise. Exactly, Bennett confirmed, and understanding that hierarchy is crucial to your strategy. The established teams expect deference. They're accustomed to newcomers being intimidated by their reputation and track record. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. That expectation is a vulnerability you can exploit. They won't perceive you as serious threats until it's too late to adjust their approach. It was a surprisingly strategic perspective from someone they had known primarily as a technical mentor revealing Bennett's deeper understanding of the competition as not merely a test of mathematical ability, but also of psychological resilience and tactical awareness. Tomorrow's written qualifier will determine seeding for the collaborative and demonstration rounds, she continued. While individual performance matters, remember that you're also establishing the team's overall position. Balance speed with accuracy and don't get trapped on any single problem. Move on if you're stuck and return later if time permits. After addressing a few logistical questions about the next day's schedule, Bennett concluded their meeting. Get rest tonight. Mental fatigue is the enemy of mathematical insight. As the team gathered their materials, Bennett asked Marcus to remain behind briefly. When the others had departed, she spoke with uncharacteristic directness. You will face additional challenges that your teammates won't, Mr. Washington. Not mathematical ones, but perceptual. Some will assume your presence is the result of tokenism rather than merit. Others will hold you to higher standards, requiring you to be exceptional where they expect others to be merely competent. Marcus maintained a neutral expression. I'm aware, Professor. I know you are, Bennett acknowledged. I mention it not because you need warning, but because I want you to know that I recognize these dynamics. They are unfair, irrational, and entirely irrelevant to mathematical truth. Your equations don't care about others' biases. There was something in her tone, a quality of personal understanding, that suggested Bennett's interest wasn't merely abstract or ideological. The history of mathematics is filled with contributions from those who were initially dismissed or excluded, she continued. Emmy Noether revolutionized abstract algebra despite being barred from faculty positions because of her gender. Srinivasa Ramanujan developed profound number theory insights without formal training, defying the colonial academic structures of his time. She met his gaze directly. Your presence in this competition matters, Mr. Washington. Not as a statement or symbol, but because mathematics advances when different perspectives approach the same problems. Marcus nodded, understanding what Bennett was offering, not pity or special consideration, but recognition of realities that often went unacknowledged in academic settings where objective merit was the theoretical standard but rarely the practical one. Thank you, Professor, he said simply. I'll focus on the mathematics. See that you do, Bennett replied, her tone returning to its usual professional formality. Tomorrow's qualifier begins at precisely 9 o'clock. I suggest you arrive by 8:30 to settle in before the examination starts. The written qualifier took place in Princeton's Richardson Auditorium, a grand circular space with tiered seating normally used for concerts and lectures, but reconfigured with individual desks spaced at precise intervals across the floor. As Marcus entered at 8:25 the following morning, the scale of the competition became visually apparent. Over 150 students from 32 universities, each representing the mathematical elite of their institutions, gathered for the first formal challenge. Marcus located his assigned seat near the center of the room, arranged his permitted materials with methodical care, and began his pre-competition centering ritual. Eyes closed, breath controlled, he mentally reviewed not specific formulas or techniques, but the broader patterns of mathematical thinking, the interconnections between seemingly disparate areas, the multiple pathways to approach complex problems, the balance between intuition and formal proof. Around him, other competitors engaged in their own preparation routines, some frantically reviewing notes until the last possible moment, others engaging in quiet conversation with teammates, still others sitting in meditative silence, similar to Marcus's own practice. At precisely 8:55, Dr. Keller approached the podium at the front of the hall. The murmur of conversation died immediately as he surveyed the assembled students with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The written qualifier consists of 8 problems spanning major areas of undergraduate and early graduate mathematics, he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall's perfect acoustics. You have 4 hours to complete as many problems as possible. Your results will determine both individual rankings and team seating for subsequent rounds. Graduate student proctors moved through the hall, distributing sealed examination packets with military precision. When every participant had received their materials, Keller checked his watch and announced, "You may begin." The sound of 150 examination packets being opened simultaneously created a paper whisper that echoed through the domed ceiling before giving way to absolute concentration as competitors confronted their challenges. Marcus scanned the problems quickly, assessing difficulty and alignment with his strengths before determining his approach sequence. The first problem involved complex analysis, finding the residues of a particularly nasty rational function with multiple poles of varying orders. The second addressed non-Euclidean geometry, requiring proof of a theorem regarding geodesics on hyperbolic spaces. The remaining problems covered group theory, differential equations, number theory, combinatorial optimization, and topological mapping. He decided to begin with the differential equations problem, which aligned with his strongest area. As he worked through the formulation, establishing boundary conditions and identifying the appropriate solution method, Marcus felt the familiar flow state emerging, that peculiar mental space where time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, where the boundaries between self and problem dissolved into pure analytical focus. By the first hour mark, he had completed 3 problems with confidence. Glancing up briefly to reset his focus, he noticed James several rows ahead, working with the intense concentration that characterized his approach. Aisha was visible at the far edge of the room, her posture suggesting steady progress. Minjun and Elena were out of his line of sight, but Marcus trusted they were applying the methodical techniques they had practiced over the past month. Returning to his examination, Marcus encountered the number theory problem, a particularly elegant question involving the distribution of prime factors that reminded him of a pattern Bennett had highlighted during their preparation. He smiled slightly as he developed his approach, appreciating the mathematical beauty embedded in the challenge. Time continued its inexorable progression, marked only by the occasional sound of turning pages and the soft footsteps of proctors patrolling the aisles. Marcus maintained his focus, moving methodically through the problems, leaving the combinatorial optimization question for last as it represented his most challenging area. When he finally reached it, with approximately 40 minutes remaining, Marcus recognized the problem's connection to research areas Minjun had introduced during their study sessions. Drawing on those discussions, he formulated an approach that might not have occurred to him working entirely independently, a tangible benefit of their collaborative preparation. As the 4-hour mark approached, Marcus completed his final verification steps, checking his solutions for consistency and logical integrity. When Keller finally announced, "Time is up. Please set down your writing implements," Marcus felt the satisfaction of having attempted all 8 problems with reasonable confidence in at least 6 of his solutions. As the proctors collected the examination packets, the hall gradually filled with the release of tension, students stretching, comparing notes in hushed tones, expressions revealing various combinations of relief, uncertainty, and exhaustion. The Westmoreland team regrouped in the lobby, each member carrying the particular mental fatigue that follows intense mathematical concentration. They compared preliminary impressions while waiting for Bennett to join them. The complex analysis problem was more straightforward than it initially appeared, James observed, once you recognized the pattern in the denominator factorization. "I thought the topology question was elegant," Aisha added, using the fixed-point theorem as a gateway to the overall proof structure. Marcus nodded in agreement. The number theory problem connected nicely to the Goldbach-type patterns we studied last week. As they continued their technical debriefing, Marcus noticed a cluster of students from MIT and Princeton watching their discussion with expressions ranging from curiosity to mild amusement, as if Westmoreland's serious analytical approach was somehow presumptuous given their outsider status. Bennett arrived before these observations could develop further, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of their performance. "We'll conduct a full debrief this afternoon," she said efficiently. "For now, you have 2 hours before results are posted. I suggest you use the time to rest and recalibrate." The team dispersed to various quiet corners of the campus, James to the mathematics department library, Aisha and Elena to a nearby cafe, Minjun to the university chapel where he found the architecture conducive to his particular form of mental reset. Marcus chose the Prospect Garden, needing fresh air and natural surroundings after the intensity of the examination hall. As he walked the winding paths between carefully tended autumn plantings, Marcus mentally reviewed his performance, not dwelling on specific solutions, which couldn't be changed now, but assessing his overall approach and identifying areas for improvement in subsequent rounds. The qualifier had been challenging but not overwhelming, suggesting that Westmoreland's preparation had indeed brought them to a competitive level despite their late start. After an hour of solitary reflection, Marcus returned to Palmer House, where results would soon be posted. He found the lobby already crowded with participants and advisors, the atmosphere charged with anticipation and competitive energy. Aisha appeared at his side, offering a bottle of water. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Centered," Marcus replied truthfully. "It was a fair assessment. Now we see where we stand." The results would be displayed on large electronic screens positioned at the front of the lobby. As the designated time approached, Dr. Keller and the competition committee emerged from a side room, triggering a hush that spread through the gathered crowd. "The written qualifier has been evaluated according to standard ICMC protocols," Keller announced formally. "Individual scores and team rankings will appear simultaneously. These results determine seeding for tomorrow's collaborative and demonstration rounds." He signaled to a technician, and the screens illuminated with two distinct displays: individual rankings on the left, team standings on the right. The crowd surged forward slightly as students sought to locate their positions in the complex hierarchy now rendered visible. Marcus scanned the individual listings, working from the top down. MIT's Preston Lee had secured first place, followed by Stanford's Jason Wong and Princeton's Sarah Cohen, all expected outcomes given their competition history. James appeared in 7th position, an impressive showing that confirmed his technical prowess. Aisha had placed 11th, another strong result. Marcus continued down the list, finally locating his own name in 14th position, solidly within the top 10% of competitors and higher than he had privately expected. Min Jun and Elena had placed 23rd and 29th respectively, giving Westmoreland a complete set of top 30 finishers. Turning his attention to the team rankings, Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. Westmoreland had secured 5th place overall, behind MIT, Princeton, Stanford, and Cambridge, but ahead of powerhouses like Caltech, Tokyo, and Moscow State. It was a placement that exceeded even Bennett's carefully calibrated expectations and immediately altered their competition narrative from unknowns to contenders. The reaction in the lobby reflected this shift. Teams that had previously dismissed Westmoreland now reassessed with more careful consideration. Faculty advisors exchanged surprised comments, and even Dr. Keller's expression suggested recalibration as he reviewed the results. Bennett arrived to find her team already gathered near the displays, their expressions revealing measured satisfaction rather than excessive celebration, exactly the professional demeanor she had cultivated throughout their preparation. "Well done," she said simply, but with genuine approval. "You've established a solid foundation for the next rounds." James, whose competitive nature made him particularly attentive to rankings, noted, "We're seeded into Group A for the collaborative round, directly against MIT, Tokyo, and Edinburgh." "A challenging bracket," Bennett acknowledged, "but also an opportunity to demonstrate your capabilities against established competitors." As the initial excitement over the results began to settle, teams dispersed to prepare for the next day's challenges. The collaborative round would require a fundamentally different approach, working together to solve complex, multifaceted problems that deliberately exceeded individual capacity, with time pressure adding another layer of difficulty. Bennett led them to a small conference room she had reserved for their afternoon strategy session. Once settled around the table, she addressed them with characteristic directness. "Your qualifier performance has altered the competition dynamics. You're no longer perceived as peripheral participants but as legitimate contenders. This brings both advantages and challenges." She looked at each team member in turn. "The advantage is psychological. You've proven to yourselves and others that you belong at this level. The challenge is that you've lost the benefit of being underestimated. Tomorrow, the established teams will approach you as genuine competition." Min Jun, who rarely spoke unless he had something specific to contribute, offered an observation. The seating places us against teams with contrasting styles. MIT favors computational brute force. Tokyo emphasizes elegant theoretical approaches, and Edinburgh is known for creative problem reformulation. Bennett nodded approvingly. Precisely, and your strategy should account for these different approaches. Where MIT may attack a problem through computational pathways, you might identify an elegant shortcut that renders such calculations unnecessary. Where Tokyo pursues theoretical elegance, you might find a pragmatic solution path that reaches the same conclusion more efficiently. They spent the next hour analyzing their qualifier performance in detail, identifying both strengths to leverage and weaknesses to address in subsequent rounds. Tomorrow we'll test the former. Your ability to maintain clear thinking under pressure, to collaborate effectively when approaches differ, and to recognize when to persist with a difficult solution path versus when to seek an alternative approach. She gathered her materials with methodical precision. Rest well tonight. The collaborative round begins at 10 tomorrow morning, and you'll need peak cognitive function throughout the day. As they departed the conference room, Marcus noticed a shift in how other competitors regarded them. The dismissive glances had been replaced by more calculating assessment, the casual disregard by wary respect. It was a subtle but significant change, reflecting their unexpected emergence as mathematical equals rather than academic tourists. For Marcus, who had navigated similar transitions throughout his academic journey, the pattern was familiar. Initial underestimation followed by reluctant recognition, with various forms of resistance in between. The difference here was that the recognition had come more quickly and decisively than usual, compressed by the objective clarity of mathematical results. As he prepared for the next day's challenges, Marcus found himself thinking about Bennett's earlier words. Mathematics doesn't operate on opinion but on proof. In a world where he had often been judged based on appearance and assumptions rather than ability, there was profound satisfaction in a discipline where truth ultimately transcended prejudice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, both mathematical and otherwise. But today, the numbers had spoken with their characteristic precision, establishing Westmoreland and Marcus Washington as undeniable variables in the ICMC equation. The collaborative round of the ICMC represented a fundamentally different challenge from the qualifier. Where the written examination had tested individual technical knowledge across a broad spectrum of mathematical areas, the collaborative phase was designed to assess how effectively teams could combine their diverse expertise to solve problems deliberately constructed to exceed individual capacity. Princeton's McDonald Hall had been transformed for this purpose, with large circular tables spaced widely throughout the main lecture hall, each equipped with multiple whiteboards, scratch paper, and a single terminal for submitting final answers. Teams would work in full view of their competitors, adding a layer of psychological pressure to the already demanding technical challenges. As Marcus entered alongside his teammates at 9:45 a.m., he felt a curious blend of tension and anticipation. The qualifier results had validated their preparation, proving they could compete individually at the ICMC level. Now came the true test of their development as a cohesive mathematical unit. They located Westmoreland's assigned table, positioned directly across from MIT's team, a placement that seemed unlikely to be coincidental. In competitive mathematics, as in chess, psychological factors were legitimate strategic elements, and placing the unexpected fifth seed directly opposite the reigning champions created natural pressure. Bennett accompanied them to their station, offering final guidance before taking her place in the advisor's seating area. "Remember your established protocols for problem assessment," she reminded them. "Take time to fully understand each challenge before committing to solution paths. Identify clear roles based on problem type, and don't allow individual stubbornness to override collective progress." These were lessons they had practiced extensively during preparation, developing systematic approaches for different mathematical scenarios. The theory was sound. Now came the practical application under competition conditions. At precisely 10:00 a.m., Dr. Keller approached the central podium. "The collaborative round consists of 5 problems to be solved within a 3-hour time frame," he announced. "Each problem has been designed to require multiple areas of mathematical expertise. Teams may approach the challenges in any order, and submit solutions as they are completed. Partial credit will be awarded for correct approaches, even if final answers remain incomplete. Graduate student proctors distributed sealed problem packets to each team. When all had been delivered, Keller announced with ceremonial precision, "You may begin." James, who had emerged as the team's natural organizational leader, quickly established their process. Everyone take 5 minutes to read through all problems independently before we discuss approach order. The 5 problems represented an intimidating array of challenges. The first involved a complex dynamical system with chaotic attractors, requiring both analytical insight and numerical approximation. The second presented a topological puzzle involving manifolds with boundary constraints. The third addressed probabilistic number theory, while the fourth explored computational complexity through combinatorial optimization. The final problem crossed disciplines entirely, applying abstract algebra to a cryptographic challenge. "Initial assessment?" James prompted after they had all reviewed the full set. "Problem 3 aligns with my strength areas," Marcus offered. "The probabilistic prime distribution has patterns similar to what we studied during preparation." "The topology question connects directly to Min-Jun's research focus," Aisha noted. "And Elena's combinatorial approach would be valuable for problem 4. "I can tackle the dynamical systems problem," James said. "The computational elements are straightforward once the analytical framework is established." They quickly settled on an attack order, beginning with problems 3 and 2 where they had strongest confidence, then addressing the cross-disciplinary challenge, and finally tackling the computational complexity and dynamical systems problems as time permitted. As they organized their approach, Marcus was aware of the activity at surrounding tables. MIT's team had immediately divided the problems among members who were working independently rather than collaboratively. Stanford had opted for a sequential approach, focusing their full collective attention on a single problem before moving to the next. Tokyo's representatives were engaged in intense discussion, apparently debating optimal strategy before committing to solution paths. Westmoreland's approach fell somewhere between these extremes. Initial division of labor based on expertise, followed by collaborative verification and synthesis. Marcus and Aisha began work on the probabilistic number theory problem, while Min-Jun and Elena tackled the topological challenge. James coordinated between groups, contributing where needed while maintaining awareness of overall progress and time constraints. The probabilistic number theory problem involved determining the asymptotic behavior of a particular class of primes under specific distributional constraints, a question that connected to Marcus's self-taught background in number patterns. As he sketched initial approaches on scratch paper, Aisha worked alongside him, identifying potential analytical shortcuts. "If we consider it as a modified Poisson process," Marcus suggested, "the distributional properties become more tractable." Aisha nodded, immediately grasping the conceptual link. "That gives us a pathway to estimate the asymptotic behavior without deriving the full distribution." Working in tandem, they developed a solution approach that combined classical analytic techniques with innovative probabilistic modeling. When they reached the computational verification stage, James joined briefly to confirm their mathematical reasoning before they finalized their answer. 90 minutes into the round, Westmoreland had completed 2 problems and made substantial progress on a third, a pace that positioned them competitively among the leading teams. James submitted their solutions through the terminal, receiving confirmation numbers that indicated successful receipt by the judging committee. As they regrouped to tackle the cross-disciplinary cryptographic challenge, Marcus became aware of increased attention from nearby competitors. MIT's team, in particular, was showing signs of surprise at Westmoreland's efficient progress, occasionally glancing toward their table with expressions of reassessment. The cryptographic problem presented a novel challenge, requiring application of abstract algebraic concepts to a practically oriented security question. Here, the team's diverse backgrounds proved especially valuable. Elena recognized the computational structure, Marcus identified the underlying algebraic patterns, and James formulated the solution algorithm. With approximately 45 minutes remaining in the round, Westmoreland had successfully completed 3 problems, and was making progress on a fourth, the computational complexity challenge that represented their most difficult area. The pressure of the ticking clock was beginning to manifest in subtle ways. Min-jun's normally methodical writing had accelerated. James was checking his watch more frequently, and conversations had become more clipped as they focused remaining energy on maximizing their completion rate. "We need to commit to either problem 1 or 4 for our final push," James said, assessing their position. "We don't have time to complete both." 4 is closer to completion, Elena argued. He considered their position relative to other teams. MIT appeared to have completed 4 problems, while Stanford and Princeton's progress was difficult to assess from their position. "Let's finish 4, he decided. A complete solution to 4 problems beats partial credit on 5. We focus everything on getting problem 4 across the finish line in the next 40 minutes. They redirected their collective attention to the computational complexity challenge, each contributing elements based on their specialty areas. Aisha identified structural patterns in the optimization space. Min-jun applied topological insights to constraint mapping. Elena developed the combinatorial algorithm, and James handled the computational implementation. Marcus moved between these approaches, identifying connection points and ensuring mathematical consistency across the integrated solution. With just 7 minutes remaining in the round, they submitted their 4th complete solution, a significant achievement for a team competing in their first ICMC. As they used the remaining time to document partial approaches to the dynamical systems problem for potential partial credit, Marcus